Told After Supper. Written by Jerome K. Jerome. Narrated by Edward E. French. Part 2. The Doctor's Story. It made me cry very much, that story. Young Biffles told it with so much feeling. We were all a little thoughtful after it, and I noticed even the old doctor covertly wipe away a tear. Uncle John brewed another bowl of punch, however, and we gradually grew more resigned. The doctor, indeed, after a while became almost cheerful, and told us about the ghost of one of his patients. I cannot give you his story. I wish I could. They all said afterwards that it was the best of the lot, the most ghastly and terrible, but I could not make any sense of it myself. It seemed so incomplete. He began all right, and then something seemed to happen, and then he was finishing it. I cannot make out what he did with the middle of the story. It ended up, I know, however, with somebody finding something, and that put Mr. Coombs in mind of a very curious affair that took place at an old mill, once kept by his brother-in-law. Mr. Coombs said he would tell us his story, and before anybody could stop him, he had begun. Mr. Coombs said the story was called The Haunted Mill, or The Ruined Home. Mr. Coombs's story. "Well, you all know my brother-in-law, Mr. Parkins," began Mr. Coombs, taking the long clay pipe from his mouth and putting it behind his ear. We did not know his brother-in-law, but we said we did, so as to save time. "And you know, of course, that he once took a lease of an old mill in Surrey and went to live there. Now, you must know that years ago this very mill had been occupied by a wicked old miser, who died there, leaving, so it was rumoured, all his money hidden somewhere about the place. Naturally enough, everyone who has since come to live at the mill had tried to find the treasure, but none had ever succeeded, and the local wiseacres said that nobody ever would, unless the ghost of the miserly miller should one day take a fancy to one of the tenants and disclose to him the secret of the hiding-place. My brother-in-law did not attach much importance to the story, regarding it as an old woman's tale, and unlike his predecessors, made no attempt whatever to discover the hidden gold. "Unless business was very different then from what it is now," said my brother-in-law, "I don't see how a miller could very well have saved anything, however much of a miser he might have been. At all events, not enough to make it worth the trouble of looking for it. Still, he could not altogether get rid of the idea of that treasure. One night he went to bed. There was nothing very extraordinary about that, I admit. He often did go to bed at night. What was remarkable, however, was that exactly as the clock of the village church chimed the last stroke of 12, my brother-in-law woke up with a start, and felt himself quite unable to go to sleep again. Joe, his Christian name was Joe, sat up in bed and looked around. At the foot of the bed something stood very still, wrapped in shadow. It moved into the moonlight, and then my brother-in-law saw that it was the figure of a wizened little old man in knee-breeches and a pigtail. In an instant the story of the hidden treasure of the old miser flashed across his mind. "He's come to show me where it's hid," thought my brother-in-law, and he resolved that he would not spend all his money on himself, but would devote a small percentage of it towards doing good to others. The apparition moved towards the door. My brother-in-law put on his trousers and followed it. The ghost went downstairs into the kitchen, glided over and stood in front of the hearth, sighed, and disappeared. Next morning Joe had a couple of bricklayers in, and made them haul out the stove and pull down the chimney, while he stood behind with a potato sack in which to put the gold. They knocked down half the wall and never found so much as a fourpenny bit. My brother-in-law did not know what to think. The next night the old man appeared again, and again led the way into the kitchen. This time, however, instead of going to the fireplace, it stood more in the middle of the room, and sighed there. "Oh, I see what he means now," said my brother-in-law to himself. "It's under the floor. Why did the old idiot go and stand up against the stove so as to make me think it was up the chimney?" They spent the next day in taking up the kitchen floor, but the only thing they found was a 3-pronged fork, and the handle of that was broken. On the third night the ghost reappeared, quite unabashed, and for a third time made for the kitchen. Arrived there, it looked up at the ceiling and vanished. "He don't seem to have learned much sense where he's been to," muttered Joe, as he trotted back to bed. I should think he might have done that at first. Still, there seemed no doubt now where the treasure lay. The first thing after breakfast, they started pulling down the ceiling. They got every inch of the ceiling down, and they took up the boards of the room above. They discovered about as much treasure as you would expect to find in an empty quart pot. On the fourth night, when the ghost appeared, as usual, my brother-in-law was so wild that he threw his boots at it, and the boots passed through the body and broke a looking-glass. On the fifth night, when Joe awoke, as he always did now at 12, the ghost was standing in a dejected attitude, looking very miserable. There was an appealing look in its large, sad eyes that quite touched my brother-in-law. After all, he thought, perhaps the silly chap's doing his best. Maybe he has forgotten where he really did put it, and is trying to remember. I'll give him another chance. The ghost appeared grateful and delighted at seeing Joe prepare to follow him, and led the way into the attic, pointed to the ceiling, and vanished. "Well, he's hit it this time, I do hope," said my brother-in-law, and next day they set to work to take the roof off the place. It took them 3 days to get the roof thoroughly off, and all they found was a bird's nest, after securing which they covered up the house with tarpaulins to keep it dry. You might have thought that would have cured the poor fellow of looking for treasure, but it didn't. He said there must be something in it all, or the ghost would never keep on coming as it did, and that, having gone so far, he would go on to the end and solve the mystery, cost what it might. Night after night he would get out of his bed and follow that spectral old fraud about the house. Each night the old man would indicate a different place, and on each following day my brother-in-law would proceed to break up the mill at the point indicated and look for the treasure. At the end of 3 weeks there was not a room in the mill fit to live in. Every wall had been pulled down, every floor had been taken up, every ceiling had had a hole knocked in it. And then, as suddenly as they had begun, the ghost's visits ceased, and my brother-in-law was left in peace to rebuild the place at his leisure. What induced the old image to play such a silly trick upon a family man and a ratepayer? Ah, that's just what I cannot tell you. Some said the ghost of the wicked old man had done it to punish my brother-in-law for not believing in him at first, while others held that the apparition was probably that of some deceased local plumber and glazier, who would naturally take an interest in seeing a house knocked about and spoilt. But nobody knew anything for certain. Interlude. We had some more punch, and then the curate told us a story. I could not make head or tail of the curate's story, so I cannot retail it to you. We none of us could make head or tail of that story. It was a good enough story as far as material went. There seemed to be an enormous amount of plot and enough incident to have made a dozen novels. I never before heard a story containing so much incident, nor one dealing with so many varied characters. I should say that every human being our curate had ever known or met or heard of was brought into that story. There were simply hundreds of them. Every 5 seconds he would introduce into the tale a completely fresh collection of characters accompanied by a brand-new set of incidents. This was the sort of story it was. "Well, then, my uncle went into the garden and got his gun, but of course it wasn't there, and Scroggins said he didn't believe it." "Didn't believe what? Who's Scroggins?" "Scroggins! Oh, why, he was the other man, you know. It was his wife." "What was his wife? What's she got to do with it?" "Why, that's what I'm telling you. It was she that found the hat. She'd come up with her cousin to London. Her cousin was my sister-in-law, and the other niece had married a man named Evans, and Evans, after it was all over, had taken the box round to Mr. Jacobs, because Jacob's father had seen the man when he was alive and when he was dead. Joseph— Now, look here. Never you mind Evans and the box. What's become of your uncle and the gun?" "The gun? What gun?" "Why, the gun that your uncle used to keep in the garden and that wasn't there. What did he do with it? Did he kill any of these people with it, these Jacobses and Evanses and Scrogginses and Josephses? Because if so, it was good and useful work, and we should enjoy hearing about it." "No. Oh, no. How could he?" He had been built up alive in the wall, you know. And when Edward IV spoke to the abbot about it, my sister said that in her state of health she could not and would not, as it was endangering the child's life. So they christened it Horatio after her own son, who had been killed at Waterloo before he was born. And Lord Napier himself said— "Look here, do you know what you're talking about?" we asked him at this point. He said no, but he knew it was, every word of it, true, because his aunt had seen it herself. Whereupon we covered him over with the tablecloth, and he went to sleep. And then Uncle told us a story. Uncle said his story was a real story. The Ghost of the Blue Chamber, my uncle's story. "I don't want to make you fellows nervous," began my uncle in a peculiarly impressive, not to say blood-curdling tone of voice. "And if you would rather I not mention it, I won't, but as a matter of fact, this very house in which we are now sitting is haunted." "You don't say that!" exclaimed Mr. Coombes. "What's the use of your saying I don't say it when I've just said it?" retorted my uncle somewhat pettishly. "You do talk so foolishly. I tell you the house is haunted. Regularly on Christmas Eve the Blue Chamber— they called the room next to the nursery the Blue Chamber at my uncle's, most of the toilet service being of that shade— is haunted by the ghost of a sinful man. A man who once killed a Christmas waite with a lump of coal." "How did he do it?" asked Mr. Coombes with eager anxiousness. "Was it difficult?" "I do not know how he did it," replied my uncle. "He did not explain the process. The waite had taken up a position just inside the front gate and was singing a ballad. It is presumed that when he opened his mouth for B-flat, the lump of coal was thrown by the sinful man from one of the windows, and that it went down the waite's throat and choked him." "You ought to be a good shot, but it's certainly worth trying," murmured Mr. Coombes thoughtfully. "But that was not his only crime, alas," added my uncle. "Prior to that he had killed a solo cornet player." "No! Is that really a fact?" exclaimed Mr. Coombes. "Of course it is a fact," answered my uncle testily. "At all events, as much of a fact as you can expect to get in a case of this sort." "How very captious you are this evening." "The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The poor fellow, the cornet player, had been in the neighbourhood barely a month. Old Mr. Bishop, who kept the Jolly Sandboys at the time, and from whom I had the story, said he had never known a more hard-working and energetic solo cornet player. He, the cornet player, only knew 2 tunes, but Mr. Bishop said that the man could not have played with more vigour or for more hours in a day if he had known 40. The 2 tunes he did play were Annie Laurie and Home Sweet Home, and as regarded his performance of the former melody, Mr. Bishop said that a mere child could have told what it was meant for. This musician, this poor friendless artist, used to come regularly and play in this street, just opposite, for 2 hours every evening. One evening he was seen, evidently in response to an invitation, going into this very house, but was never seen coming out of it." "Did the townsfolk try offering any reward for his recovery?" asked Mr. Coombes. "Not a halfpenny," replied my uncle. "Another summer," continued my uncle, "a German band visited here, intending, so they announced on their arrival, to stay till the autumn. On the 2nd day from their arrival, the whole company, as fine and healthy a body of men as one could wish to see, were invited to dinner by this sinful man, and, after spending the whole of the next 24 hours in bed, left the town a broken and dyspeptic crew, the parish doctor, who had attended them, giving it as his opinion that it was doubtful if they would, any of them, be fit to play an air again." You don't know the recipe, do you?" asked Mr. Coombes. "Unfortunately I do not," replied my uncle. but the chief ingredient was said to have been railway refreshment room pork pie. I forget the man's other crimes, my uncle went on. I used to know them all at one time, but my memory is not what it was. I do not, however, believe I am doing his memory an injustice in believing that he was not entirely unconnected with the death and subsequent burial of a gentleman who used to play the harp with his toes, and that neither was he altogether unresponsible for the lonely grave of an unknown stranger who had once visited the neighbourhood, an Italian peasant lad, a performer upon the barrel organ. "Every Christmas Eve," said my uncle, cleaving with low, impressive tones the strange, awed silence that, like a shadow, seemed to have slowly stolen into and settled down upon the room, "the ghost of this sinful man haunts the Blue Chamber in this very house. There, from midnight till cock-crow," amid wild muffled shrieks and groans and mocking laughter, and the ghostly sound of horrid blows, it does fierce phantom fight with the spirits of the solo cornet-player and the murdered wait, assisted at intervals by the shades of the German band, while the ghost of the strangled harpist plays mad ghostly melodies with ghostly toes on the ghost of a broken harp. Uncle said that the Blue Chamber was comparatively useless as a sleeping apartment on Christmas Eve. "Hark!" said Uncle, raising a warning hand towards the ceiling while we held our breath and listened. "Hark! I believe they're at it now. In the Blue Chamber!" The Blue Chamber. I rose up and said that I would sleep in the Blue Chamber. Before I tell you my own story, however, the story of what happened in the Blue Chamber, I would wish to preface it with a personal explanation. I feel a good deal of hesitation about telling you this story of my own. You see, it is not a story like the other stories that I've been telling you, or rather that Teddy Biffles, Mr. Coombs, and my uncle have been telling you. It is a true story. It is not a story told by a person sitting round a fire on Christmas Eve drinking whiskey punch. It is a record of events that actually happened. Indeed, it is not a story at all in the commonly accepted meaning of the word. It is a report. It is, I feel, almost out of place in a book of this kind. It is more suitable to a biography or an English history. There's another thing that makes it difficult for me to tell you this story, and that is that it is all about myself. In telling you this story, I shall have to keep on talking about myself, and talking about ourselves is what we modern-day authors have a strong objection to doing. If we literary men of the new school have one praiseworthy yearning more ever present to our minds than another, it is the yearning never to appear in the slightest degree egotistical. I myself, so I am told, carry this coyness, this shrinking reticence concerning anything connected with my own personality almost too far, and people grumble at me because of it. People come to me and say, "Well now, why don't you talk about yourself a bit? That's what we want to read about. Tell us something about yourself." But I have always replied, no. It is not that I do not think the subject an interesting one. I cannot myself conceive of any topic more likely to prove fascinating to the world as a whole, or at all events to the cultured portion of it. But I will not do it, on principle. It is inartistic, and it sets a bad example to the younger men. Other writers, a few of them, do it, I know. But I will not as a rule. Under ordinary circumstances, therefore, I should not tell you this story. I should say to myself, no. It is a good story. It is a moral story. It is a strange, weird, enthralling sort of a story, and the public, I know, would like to hear it, and I should like to tell it to them. But it is all about myself, about what I said, and what I saw, and what I did, and I cannot do it. My retiring, anti-egotistical nature will not permit me to talk in this way about myself. But the circumstances surrounding this story are not ordinary. There are reasons prompting me, in spite of my modesty, to rather welcome the opportunity of relating it. My own story. As soon as my uncle had finished his story, I, as I have already told you, rose up and said that I would sleep in the blue chamber that very night. "Never!" cried my uncle, springing up. "You shall not put yourself in this deadly peril. Besides, the bed is not made." "Never mind the bed," I replied. "I have lived in furnished apartments for gentlemen, and have been accustomed to sleep on beds that have never been made up from one year's end to the other. Do not thwart me in my resolve. I am young, and have had a clear conscience now for over a month. The spirits will not harm me. I may even do them some little good, and induce them to be quiet and go away. Besides, I should like to see the show." Saying which, I sat down again. How Mr. Coombs came to be in my chair instead of at the other end of the room where he had been all the evening, and why he never offered to apologize when I sat right down on top of him, and why young Biffles should have tried to palm himself off upon me as my Uncle John, and induced me, under that erroneous impression, to shake him by the hand for nearly 3 minutes, and tell him that I had always regarded him as father, are matters that to this day I have never been able to fully understand. They tried to dissuade me from what they termed my foolhardy enterprise, but I remained firm and claimed my privilege. I was the guest. The guest always sleeps in the haunted chamber on Christmas Eve. It is his prerequisite. They said that if I put it on that footing, they had, of course, no answer, and they lighted a candle for me and accompanied me upstairs in a body. Whether elevated by the feeling that I was doing a noble action, or animated by a mere general consciousness of rectitude, is not for me to say, but I went upstairs that night with remarkable buoyancy. It was as much as I could do to stop at the landing when I came to it. I felt I wanted to go up to the roof, but with the help of the banisters I restrained my ambition, wished them all good night, and went in and shut the door. Things began to go wrong with me from the very first. The candle tumbled out of the candlestick before my hand was off the lock. It kept on tumbling out of the candlestick, and every time I picked it up and put it in, it tumbled out again. I never saw such a slippery candle. I gave up attempting to use the candlestick at last, and carried the candle about in my hand, and even then it would not keep upright. So I got wild and threw it out of window, and undressed, and went to bed in the dark. I did not go to sleep. I did not feel sleepy at all. I lay on my back, looking up at the ceiling and thinking of things. I wish I could remember some of the ideas that came to me as I lay there, because they were so amusing. I laughed at them myself till the bed shook. I had been lying like this for half an hour or so, and had forgotten all about the ghost, when, on casually casting my eyes round the room, I noticed for the first time a singularly contented-looking phantom, sitting in the easy-chair by the fire, smoking the ghost of a long clay pipe. I fancied for the moment, as most people would under similar circumstances, that I must be dreaming. I sat up and rubbed my eyes. No, it was a ghost, clear enough. I could see the back of the chair through his body. He looked over towards me, took the shadowy pipe from his lips, and nodded. The most surprising part of the whole thing to me was that I did not feel in the least alarmed. If anything, I was rather pleased to see him. It was company. I said, "Good evening. It's been a cold day." He said he had not noticed it himself, but dared say I was right. We remained silent for a few seconds, and then, wishing to put it pleasantly, I said, "I believe I have the honor of addressing the ghost of the gentleman who had the accident with the weight?" He smiled, and said it was very good of me to remember it. One weight was not much to boast of, but still every little helped. I was somewhat staggered by his answer. I had expected a groan of remorse. The ghost appeared, on the contrary, to be rather conceited over the business. I thought that, as he had taken my reference to the weight so quietly, Perhaps he would not be offended if I questioned him about the organ grinder. I felt curious about that poor boy. "Is it true," I asked, "that you had a hand in the death of that Italian peasant lad who came to town once with a barrel organ that played nothing but Scotch airs?" He quite fired up. "Had a hand in it!" he exclaimed indignantly. "Who has dared to pretend that he assisted me? I murdered the youth myself. Nobody helped me. Alone I did it. Show me the man who says I didn't." I calmed him. I assured him that I had never in my own mind doubted that he was the real and only assassin. And I went on and asked him what he had done with the body of the cornet player he had killed. He said, "To which one may you be alluding?" "Oh, there were any more, then?" I inquired. He smiled and gave a little cough. He said that he did not like to appear to be boasting, but that, counting trombones, there were 7. "Dear me," I replied, "you must have had quite a busy time of it, one way and another." He said that perhaps he ought not to be the one to say so, but that, really, speaking of ordinary middle society, he thought there were few ghosts who could look back upon a life of more sustained usefulness. He puffed away in silence for a few seconds while I sat watching him. I had never seen a ghost smoking a pipe before that I could remember, and it interested me. I asked him what tobacco he used, and he replied, "The ghost of cut Cavendish, as a rule." He explained that the ghost of all the tobacco that a man smoked in life belonged to him when he became dead. He said he himself had smoked a good deal of cut Cavendish when he was alive, so that he was well supplied with the ghost of it now. I observed that it was a useful thing to know that, and I made up my mind to smoke as much tobacco as ever I could before I died. I thought I might as well start at once, so I said I would join him in a pipe, and he said, "Do, old man," and I reached over and got out the necessary paraphernalia from my coat pocket and lit up. We grew quite chummy after that, and he told me all his crimes. He said he had lived next door once to a young lady who was learning to play the guitar, while a gentleman who practiced on the bass viol lived opposite, and he, with fiendish cunning, had introduced these two unsuspecting young people to one another, and had persuaded them to elope with each other against their parents' wishes, and to take their musical instruments with them. And they had done so, and, before the honeymoon was over, she had broken his head with the bass viol, and he had tried to cram the guitar down her throat, and had injured her for life. My friend said he used to lure muffin men into the passage and then stuff them with their own wares till they burst and died. He said he had quieted 18 that way. Young men and women who recited long and dreary poems at evening parties, and callow youths who walked about the streets late at night playing concertinas. He used to get together and poison in batches of 10, so as to save expense, and park orators and temperance lecturers he used to shut up 6 in a small room with a glass of water and a collection box apiece, and let them talk each other to death. It did one good to listen to him. I asked him when he expected the other ghosts, the ghosts of the wait and the cornet player, and the German band that Uncle John had mentioned. He smiled, and said they would never come again, any of them. I said, "Why isn't it true, then, that they meet you here every Christmas Eve for a row?" He replied that it was true. Every Christmas Eve for 25 years had he and they fought in that room. But they would never trouble him nor anybody else again. One by one he had laid them out, spoilt and utterly useless for all haunting purposes. He had finished off the last German band ghost that very evening, just before I came upstairs, and had thrown what was left of it out through the slit between the window sashes. He said it would never be worth calling a ghost again. "I suppose you will still come yourself, as usual?" I said. "They would be so sorry to miss you, I know." "Oh, I don't know," he replied. "There's nothing much to come for now. Unless," he added kindly, "you are going to be here. I'll come if you will sleep here next Christmas Eve. I've taken a liking to you," he continued. "You don't fly off screeching when you see a party, and your hair doesn't stand on end. "You've no idea," he said, "how sick I am of seeing people's hair standing on end." He said it irritated him. Just then a slight noise reached us from the yard below, and he started and turned deathly black. "You are ill," I cried, springing towards him. "Tell me the best thing to do for you. Shall I drink some brandy and give you the ghost of it?" He remained silent, listening intently for a moment, and then he gave a sigh of relief, and the shade came back to his cheek. "It's all right," he murmured. "I was afraid it was the cock." "Oh, it's too early for that," I said. "Why, it's only the middle of the night." "Oh, that doesn't make any difference to those cursed chickens," he replied bitterly. "They would just as soon crow in the middle of the night as at any other time. Sooner, if they thought it would spoil a chap's evening out. I believe they do it on purpose." He said a friend of his, the ghost of a man who had killed a water-rate collector, used to haunt a house in Longacre where they kept fowls in the cellar, and every time a policeman went by and flashed his bull's-eye down the grating, the old cock there would fancy it was the sun and start crowing like mad, when, of course, the poor ghost had to dissolve, and it would, in consequence, get back home sometimes as early as 1 o'clock in the morning, swearing fearfully because it had only been out for an hour. I agreed that it seemed very unfair. "Oh, it's an absurd arrangement altogether," he continued, quite angrily. "I can't imagine what our old man could have been thinking of when he made it. As I have said to him over and over again, have a fixed time, and let everybody stick to it. Say 4 o'clock in the summer and 6 in winter. Then one would know what one was about." "How do you manage when there isn't any cock handy?" I inquired. He was on the point of replying when again he started and listened. This time I distinctly heard Mr. Bowles's cock next door crow twice. "There you are," he said, rising and reaching for his hat. "That's the sort of thing we have to put up with. What is the time?" I looked at my watch and found it was 3:30. "I thought as much," he muttered. "I'll wring that blessed bird's neck if I get hold of it." And he prepared to go. "If you can wait half a minute," I said, getting out of bed, "I'll go a bit of the way with you." "It's very good of you," he rejoined, pausing, "but it seems unkind to drag you out." "Not at all," I replied. "I shall like a walk." And I partially dressed myself, and took my umbrella, and he put his arm through mine, and we went out together. Just by the gate we met Jones, one of the local constables. "Good night, Jones," I said. I always feel affable at Christmas time. "Good night, sir," answered the man, a little gruffly, I thought. "May I ask what you're a-doing of?" "Oh, it's all right," I responded with a wave of my umbrella. "I'm just seeing my friend part of the way home." He said, "What friend?" "Oh, of course," I laughed. "I forgot he's invisible to you. He is the ghost of the gentleman that killed the wait. I'm just going to the corner with him." "I don't think I would if I was you, sir," said Jones severely. "If you take my advice, you'll say good-bye to your friend here and go back indoors. Perhaps you are not aware that you are walking about with nothing on but a nightshirt and a pair of boots and an opera hat. Where's your trousers?" I did not like the man's manner at all. I said, "Jones, I don't wish to have to report you, but it seems to me you've been drinking. My trousers are where a man's trousers ought to be, on his legs. I distinctly remember putting them on." "Well, you haven't got them on now," he retorted. "I beg your pardon," I replied. "I tell you I have. I think I ought to know." "I think so, too," he answered. "But you evidently don't. Now you come along indoors with me, and don't let's have any more of it." Uncle John came to the door at this point, having been awaked, I suppose, by the altercation, and at the same moment Aunt Maria appeared at the window in her nightcap. I explained the constable's mistake to them, treating the matter as lightly as I could, so as not to get the man into trouble, and I turned for confirmation to the ghost. He was gone. He had left me without saying a word, without even saying good-bye. It struck me as so unkind, his having gone off that way, that I burst into tears, and Uncle John came out and led me back into the house. On reaching my room, I discovered that Jones was right. I had not put on my trousers after all. They were still hanging over the bed-rail. I suppose, in my anxiety not to keep the ghost waiting, I must have forgotten them. Such are the plain facts of the case, out of which it must, doubtless, to the healthy, charitable mind, appear impossible that calumny could spring. But it has. Persons, I say persons, have professed themselves unable to understand the simple circumstances herein narrated, except in the light of explanations at once misleading and insulting. Slurs have been cast, and aspersions made on me by those of my own flesh and blood. But I bear no ill feeling. I merely, as I have said, set forth this statement for the purpose of clearing my character from injurious suspicion. The End.